So I was in the subway this week, and my friend happened to catch a bucket drummer on the L train platform. Bucket drummers in NYC run the gamut. There are okay ones, and then there are some really good ones. But I could tell from just 2 minutes of listening that this guy was one of the good ones. My friend, who's not a formally trained musician, was like, "How do you know?" It's then that I put into words something I'd long suspected. There are a bunch of things professional musicians use to evaluate whether somebody's good that aren't immediately obvious to the public. So today, 5 non-obvious ways professional musicians tell a good drummer from a bad one. Secret ability number 5, kit control. When I was in high school and college, I used to play some jazz festivals, and I got to watch guest artists sit in on my drums and play with the band. It's a rare and perfect opportunity to conduct an experiment. How does Greg Hutchinson, Billy Kilson, Lewis Nash, Brian Blade, etc. sound on the same kit I play, in the same acoustic environment, sometimes with the same musicians? And that's when I realized skill number 5 was a thing, kit control. To put it bluntly, know how when you go into a drum store and sit down on an unfamiliar kit, your timing and feel and playing can be off just because things are different heights and the kick pedal has a different spring tension, so your playing suffers a little bit. Great drummers don't have this. They can sit down on almost any kit and sound great immediately. And it's not even that their best is so good that 75% of that still sounds great. Nope, their playing doesn't even suffer. Like, here's Eric Harlan playing some random implements in a backyard. It's not like he practiced them for hours. He just went in and made them sound great. So, why do great drummers do this? It's because their drumming comes from their ears down, not their limbs up. Their ears already know when their timing's supposed to be, so their limbs automatically adjust to whatever surface or spring tension they're playing on, so that the ultimate sound is perfect. I know this because after decades of sitting in on other people's kits in New York, I started to feel it. Tiny stage at Cornelia Street Cafe? No problem. Off-Broadway pit? No problem. But it took me years. Why is this important? In professional situations, usually on gigs, not so much on rehearsals, you'll rarely be able to reproduce the tactile and acoustic environment you're used to at home. Like the time I binned it on an audition because the feel of the kit I was playing on was all wrong. Better drummers didn't let that affect them, and one of them got the gig. But this might not be obvious to you unless you'd experienced both sides of it. So that's why I'm telling you. Secret ability number 4, the ability to learn music quickly. Unlike the others, ability number 4 is something about which you'd think, yeah, I could see that. To anybody who's played in a few bands, much less been to music school, it's obvious you need to learn music quickly. But to hobbyist musicians, or those just starting out, or even people in some high school and college situations, it's not obvious just how big the gulf is between the way they learn music and the way the pros do it. So first, the obvious point, then the more subtle part, why it's so subversive. Obvious. Here's Steve Smith's VF Jam. If you don't know already, I'll tell you. These guys probably got an hour or less of rehearsal to learn this. I don't know about the specific situation, but trust me, plenty of musicians who have played things like this in situations like this have learned it in less than an hour. Sometimes they've learned it in just 1 or 2 run-throughs. I'm not talking about reading either necessarily. Here's Matt Garstka's latest Mehldau video. Nobody's reading a thing. But I bet these guys learned pretty fast. Or Matt taught it to the guitarist quickly. On the other side are the weekender hobbyist bands, in which people rehearse the same tunes over and over, getting ready for the big gig. And look, that's a cool way to learn too, especially for people at that level. But here's what's non-obvious. If you're a practice room warrior with fast hands, and even great fills and combos, and you've rarely been in a high-level rehearsal situation, you won't be prepared for the difference between the best players and the average ones when it comes to learning tunes quickly. Here's the other thing. There's learning the tune, then there's being able to play it under gig pressure with a ton of eyeballs on you. Two very different things. Again, not obvious unless you've experienced it. But there are too many people who sound great in the practice room who don't have this skill. That's why it made the list. Ability number 3, lock up. I've talked in the Great Drummers All Do This Can You episode about the ability to play cleanly with yourself. But it's possible to play perfectly cleanly with yourself and still not lock up with a band. Here's the assumption I used to make when I was playing with others. If it feels good to me, it sounds good. Not necessarily. Listen to this clip of the Police playing live.
Just a castaway, I done lost at sea, another lonely day.
Now listen to this cover of the same song.
More loneliness than anyone can bear. Rescue me before falling to despair.
Just like kick control, most people don't realize how much better the pros are than the rest of us at locking up with the rest of the band, even in crappy acoustic environments. Novices often realize this the first time they play a festival, or even in a pressure situation. All of a sudden, they're hearing things with a more critical ear and putting themselves in the audience's shoes, and they realize, oh, we don't sound that locked up. But why? What's missing? Where did the magic go? Well, high-level drummers have the ability to lock up with the band so that they sound like a single integrated unit. They're feeling the beats in the same place, and they're breathing together. My favorite thing about this one is it has nothing whatsoever to do with chops. At least as we traditionally think of them. Here's Jorge Rossi, who, while he's got facility, definitely doesn't have Eric Harlan's hands. By contrast, here's a drummer getting some chops out, but not locking up at all. Why do we care? If the band doesn't sound good, it doesn't matter how fast your hands are. It doesn't even matter how good your time, feel, or groove is as an individual if you can't lock up with the band. You won't get the gig. Secret ability number 2. The ability to hit figures with the band without losing the groove. This one pops out at me whenever I hear one of those best drummer ever clips from Guitar Center Drum Off. The dude's playing some kind of Afro-Cuban or Afro-Brazilian inspired groove. And you can tell right away that if he had to play figures with a band on top of that groove, it would come apart at the seams, or at least not lock up very well. But to an untrained ear, he sounds pretty good, right? That's why people who have played in real-life situations for decades hear things differently than the casual observer does. Here's a good recent example of this from VF Jams. But the fact that this is difficult and a different skill from just being able to play the drums might not be obvious to a novice. Here's an example of somebody doing it not so great. This is important for the same reason the last one was. Just because you can play cool grooves by yourself in the practice room doesn't mean you'll be able to hit figures against them while playing with a band. Pros know this. A lot of the general public probably doesn't. Before we hit number 1, and by the way, this is how I was able to recognize the skill of that bucket drummer. A quick point about why this is important. There's a big divide on YouTube about what constitutes good drumming. I'm not going to be a snob and say there's only one way to evaluate what's good and what's not. And I'm not going to gloss over that being a showman and holding a crowd's attention during a drum solo is also a skill, one that not all pro drummers do well. So I'm not trying to shit on some of these examples. But when I get comments like, how can you say Dylan Leese is not the world's greatest drummer? And probably the best comment I've gotten in years, guys with hands like us can see dudes like you coming a mile away. I feel the need to push back a little. I'm not trying to say they're wrong and I'm right, but rather that the people hiring for professional music seats are listening to different things than they are. Sure, there's some overlap, but there's also a big list of things that they're hearing that you might not be. Okay, on to non-obvious to novices, but obvious to pros ability number one. Secret ability number one. Keep the one and don't get lost. When non-trained people see a drummer playing, they're not doing something musical pros can't help but do. Counting in their heads. But after 25 years of playing and 6 years of music school, pros literally can't help counting along. It's a survival instinct, honed from thousands of hours of hanging on for dear life during difficult tunes. With confusing figures coming at you, often at the risk of derailing the whole tune and having to stop and restart, many times in front of an audience. Just like a trained MMA fighter will grab a Kimura grip before he even realizes it if an opponent gets careless and leaves an elbow out, a pro musician will subconsciously grab hold of any part of the beat and immediately try to orient themselves to the one. That's why they can tell if a drummer, even if he's playing solo, has the same framework in his head. And this bucket drummer did. He played 3-beat phrases against the beat. He played 5-beat phrases against the beat. Then he landed perfectly on the one. I heard it. My friend, he told me, didn't. But it was a real recognized real moment. A costly signal. In conclusion, if you're a drummer who wants to play gigs, you should keep these things in mind. Pro musicians are going to be able to hear things that you maybe aren't. And your solos might be great, and you might even have great feel and great timing when you play in the practice room by yourself. But unless you master these 5 things, you may be left wondering why the guy with fewer chops than you got the gig and you didn't. I sure was for years. Don't be like I was. Be better than I was. So guys, I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. And if you did enjoy it, I'd like to remind you the 80/20 Drummer, the YouTube channel, is brought to you by the 80/20 Drummer suite of courses. And one course you might find interesting, if you find this stuff interesting, is the coaching course, which takes you through each of these 5 abilities in depth with exercises to work on week by week and exactly what I practiced to become better at these skills when I finally realized I was lacking in them. If you'd like to learn more about the course and get a completely free gateway drug that showcases some of my more sequenced lessons, I recommend you click the link below the video, enter your email in on the next page, and I'll send you 3 completely free videos that I assert will improve your playing more in the next 3 weeks than it's improved in the last 6 months. Dudes, it's been fun. I really enjoy these. I'll be back next week with another lesson of the week. We're gonna switch hands. Oh, that's better.